Splendid. It's the awfulness of technological connections in the southwest, in the depths of the countryside. Okay, so I've got 15 minutes to talk about climate change in higher education. I want to begin with three principles and a slogan. The three principles I have is, one is climate emergency is real and it's happening. And I think we should stop talking about climate change and talk about climate emergency. Secondly, I want to disagree with all the pessimists by saying, actually, we can do something about it. We can do something to stop and reverse the climate emergency that's happening. But thirdly, in order to do that, we want to make some really fundamental changes to the way in which we think about the world. So my slogan at the end of this is system change, not climate change. So I want to begin, though, with a quotation from the most recent Zero Carbon Britain report, which is right on the first page of that report. It's fascinating. If you want to download it from the Centre for Alternative Technology website, it begins with a quotation which reads, "Relying on speculative future technology to get to net zero risks overshooting the remaining carbon budget, resulting in the very real possibility of global temperature rises of over 2 degrees centigrade or more. We should stop thinking that there's going to be a technological solution about which we know nothing, and begin to think about how we use where we are today." The report goes on to say, by modelling a zero carbon scenario using only technology that is available that is ready to be rolled out at scale, Centre for Alternative Technologies research shows that there is no good reason to take this risk. We have the technology to combat climate change, and we can start today. What we need is the political will to make those changes. And I frankly am sceptical, to put it mildly, in the any kind of reliance on the powers that be in the world today having the political will to make those changes. I think they are too deeply embedded in a fossil fuel economy to ever make that break. So my third point, really coming from that, and I'll come back to this as I talk, is that kind of fundamental change in the way we will need to change the world really is about bringing to an end the belief that it's possible for the world's economy to just go on growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. That's simply not possible. What we need to do is move towards a zero growth economy, which is more equitably distributed. Okay, how does that all fit into higher education? I want to talk about four things in higher education that I think are the four things that we need to think about changing in order to make what we do as academics and academic related staff and support staff a real commitment to making combating the climate emergency a reality. And the first thing to begin with really is the kind of operational infrastructures that universities use today. Now, for the Open University, it's very different to other universities where they have much bigger capital basis in buildings and stuff. That's, one of the disasters we've seen in higher education over the last 10 years is the diverting of resources away from supporting students through well-paid, decently employed teaching staff to building lots of very nice flashy buildings. Now, it's somewhat different at the Open University, but I still want to argue that the way in which we think about how we use buildings is still an important part of that. I walk around Milton Keynes occasionally, and indeed around the offices in Cardiff and Edinburgh and Belfast. And the most basic move towards making those buildings individually sustainable really aren't being made. I want to see many more wind turbines, many more solar panels on all of those buildings. The other shift, of course, is in the teaching centres we use. I'm constantly frustrated that as teaching centres, the university is still using hotels, expensive hotels, which have appalling records in terms of sustainability. I want to see us making a commitment to using just community premises and community resources in all the communities around Britain that have easy access to public transport and that are easily accessible to all groups of students. Now, I've had the experience of teaching in venues which are only accessible by car, realistically, unless you want to make a 25-minute walk to the nearest railway station. That sink is simply not acceptable. I think, and just to the kind of sense of the kind of fundamental systematic change that we need to make, the kind of transport infrastructure that supports people getting from various parts of Milton Keynes and other parts of the country to the Open University offices at Walton Hall for meetings, for all kinds of engagement with the university as a whole. They're frankly dreadful. You know, there are huge car parks, a terrible bus service, and no integration with the rail network. You know, I hear terrible stories really about people flying from distant parts of the country to meetings in Milton Keynes that last for an hour and a half, and that frankly needs to stop. I think the university needs to make a commitment to saying we will no longer use air transport, and if that means giving staff longer to get to meetings, making research leave longer so that people can take the ship to the United States to go to conferences, it'll mean they get there, they'll be less stressed. All of those kind of shifts really need to begin to happen. The other thing I think that's about infrastructure and organisation is really the way in which universities invest their money these days. Now, there are two aspects to that. One is capital investment and the extent to which universities' investments really are, to put it mildly, mostly unethical. And I think there needs to be a really fundamental shift in that. If people want to check out the Share Action website, it talks both about investment more generally, but also, and more obviously and more immediately to our point this last 10 days, the way in which our pension money is invested. Because, of course, that pension money is being invested in order to make the maximum amount of return. And that's quite often that those investments are being made in some frankly unacceptable locations. I think so. Those are two shifts that I think we need to begin to make. Now, I want to get on to the two. That's the kind of basic nuts and bolts of the kind of changes we need to begin to make, really, in order for us to have any kind of ethical or moral status in the debate about what we do about climate change in the world outside. The two other issues I want to talk about really are research and curriculum, because I think it's really important that we begin to integrate the whole debate about the climate emergency into every aspect of what we do as institutions of higher education. And that means, first of all, most obviously in the area of research, there are, I think, three areas in which we can talk about important kinds of research that universities should be doing. The first is obviously the kind of technical scientific research. So things like developing really reliable electrical batteries for cars so that electric cars become a viable proposition. Where I live, every morning from 7:30 till about 9:15, the traffic queuing to get into Exeter is piled back 3 miles in a stationary queue of people sitting in their cars, usually on their own, and just frankly puking out fumes. One of the, there are a number of changes that are obvious, that can obviously be made to that. And I think universities, the scientific and technological engineering departments of universities have a really fundamentally important part to play in making a shift towards addressing what is, let's face it, an existential crisis for human beings on this planet. two more areas in which I think the change can happen. One is in kind of sociological research. How do we get messages about climate emergency and what people can do about it and why it's real over to large audiences? I think one of the problems that Extinction Rebellion faces in this country at the moment is that it's still by far the most successful mass movement since the campaigns against the Iraq War 16 years ago, but it's still, in terms of its impact on local communities, really negligible. In Exeter, we have meetings of maybe 100, 150 people, which look great. There's 120,000 people living in the city. So we need, I think, people in universities to be thinking, how do we address the whole question of how we get that message out to the world outside? And last of all, I think it's a kind of pedagogical question, which I think all academics need to address, and it's a question I think we address in all kinds of ways already, which is how do we explain complexity to people? How do we explain a complicated argument to a large audience? Because the whole debate about climate change and the whole debate about earth science is really a complex debate. I work in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and I teach literature and film. So my grasp of the hard core of the science is sometimes a bit limited. I think that's a problem. I think that's an issue that universities should be addressing. In the 1950s, C.P. Snow talked about the division between sciences and arts and how pernicious that was in terms of people's education. One of the great things about having been a postgraduate student in the United States is that I was forced to take a couple of science courses. So if anybody ever needs a geodesic dome building in their garden, I'm your man. And last of all, I want to talk about curriculum, because it seems to me we need to integrate the whole issue of climate emergency into the curriculum that we teach. Now, again, that's most obvious in the areas of science and engineering and technology. And I'm really pleased that at the UCU Congress this year, we got into a conversation with some people from FE colleges who were saying that they now get their students to work over and over again on small technological and engineering projects that are about providing solutions to sustainable and renewable energy and sustainable and renewable projects in the areas in which they live. I was chatting very nicely to this guy and saying, this is great, this is really interesting, we must talk more about this. And he said, yes, let's go out and have a cup of coffee sometime, because I live in Exeter too. So, making those connections, I think, is a really important thing. But what does it mean for somebody like me who teaches literature and film? Well, I think it addresses the question of, very simply, how we change the way we think and act. And cultural history, I think, can play a really important part in that, because I would like to teach a module which talks about how, over time, the relationship between human beings and the planet we live on and the natural world in which we exist is a course that runs from, if you like, Gilgamesh and the Bible to Richard Powers' The Overstory, which was published last year and won the Pulitzer Prize this year, which would talk about the ways in which human beings have developed positive and negative ways of existing and coexisting with the natural world around them. Because if we don't do that, we are doomed. Okay. An immediate part of that is that I have been, because I teach A111, we're about to do Christmas, appropriately enough, really. And so I've been doing a lot of reading about the way in which people have celebrated Christmas in different ways over the last 2,000 years. And one of the things that really emerges from that is a series of ways in which people celebrate the season in ways that are seasonal, and ways in which, and that's a very positive thing from where I'm sitting, and ways in which they celebrate in a very unseasonal fashion. And I think, so what I want to finish by saying is, I'm looking forward to the solstice in a couple of weeks. I'm looking forward to some really big demonstrations about ending the climate emergency and spending a lot of time talking to people about how we do this. And I'm also looking forward to thinking on Friday, going to Manchester on the train and thinking about what the next stage of our industrial dispute is. So thank you all for listening. It's been really instructive for me to think about what I wanted to say today, because it connects what I do when I'm not working for the Open University to what I do when I am working for the Open University, and making me think again about why it is that I teach literature and film, and why I think those two things are so important in terms of thinking about climate emergency. Thank you very much. If you want to talk to me some more, please email me through the Open University email system. Don't use it until tomorrow. And I'd be delighted to continue this conversation. Thank you very much.